Hello, class. I'm Professor Satterwhite, of course, and I wanted to talk to you a little bit more about Phillis Wheatley. I have a couple different versions of her book, but I wanted to show you a few of these before we began. So, when we last talked about Phillis Wheatley, one of the things that we talked about was her biography. I think her biography is really fascinating in that it allows us to, or understanding her biography is fascinating because it allows us to better understand her poetry and her poetical work. That's not always the case with authors, but I find that it is important for us to get a better understanding of a number of the authors that we'll be looking at in this class. Now, again, it's not crucial, and in some ways it moves against a lot of what we learn in literary studies. To have the author be gone, the author's not here, the author's dead, and all we have is their work, and we're supposed to examine the work. And I definitely believe that aspect of literary study, so I'm not knocking that by any way or in any way. However, I think it's important for us to understand when we're looking at African American literature, but in particular the narratives and the poetry and the writing of people that were enslaved, that it's important for us to understand their biography. So hence why we spent a good bit of time talking about that in class. So understanding that and understanding the attestation that was written for Phillis Wheatley so she can get her book published. If you remember the story about the number of great Boston citizens, some of Boston's most elite citizens, getting together, grilling Phillis Wheatley hours for hours and hours, and then eventually coming to the conclusion that yes, she's a human being. Yes, it is possible for this human being to write these poems, and she is likely that person to have written them. So while seeming obvious and seeming insulting in many ways, especially from a modern context, it was an incredibly big moment when that happened. What I'm going to do is I'm going to read a little piece from Henry Louis Gates, and this is in his book, The Trials of Phillis Wheatley. And in this book, The Trials of Phillis Wheatley, which I strongly recommend that you read. It's available. It's available through the library. If you get the chance, it's worth reading. But I'm going to read a few lines just to talk about the importance of the trial and her ability to pass the trial. And I put this in quotes too. It's not necessarily a trial, and we really don't know exactly what happened in the discussions. All we know is that they came together and they said, yes, she wrote these works. So anyway, all of this helps us, this is from Henry Louis Gates, all of this helps us to understand why Wheatley's oral examination was so important. If she had indeed written her poems, then this would demonstrate that Africans were human beings and should be liberated from slavery. If, on the other hand, she had not written or could not write her poems, or if indeed she was like the parrot who speaks a few words plainly, then that would be another matter entirely. Essentially, she was auditioning for the humanity of the entire African people. You think of that, you think of the pressure for her, and it's impossible for us to know whether she understood this or not, or if she knew that her doing this and what she did would be seen years later as one of our many famous firsts. But nonetheless, it's an incredible feat that she accomplished, and she accomplished this, in her still in her teenage years. So I have undying, respect, but then also just incredible admiration for this poet. So knowing that her work was going to be read by so many people, then probably the poem that would be seen by the most people would be the poem on being brought from Africa to America. There's a lot of people that have gone over that poem in many different ways. I have, some interpretations, of the poem that might counter or might be different than other folks. But largely, I think that, most of the scholars now look at this work to say that it's not reading exactly as it reads. That there's more to this poem than we see when we just look at it as a straightforward poem. But I'll read it quickly. On being brought from Africa to America. 'Twas mercy brought me from my pagan land, taught my benighted soul to understand that there is a God, there is a Savior too. Once I redemption neither sought nor knew. Some view our sable race with scornful eye. Their color is a diabolic dye. Remember, Christians, Negroes, black as Cain, may be refined and join the angelic train. And I think that when we look at this poem, there's a few things important to remember is that by the title alone and her specifically discussing the condition of slavery, that we can assume that this would be the very first poem that people moved to when they looked at this. So knowing that's the case, and we can also assume that this poem would have possibly more scrutiny than any other piece. It's interesting too because if you look at her work, it's really one of her shortest poems. In fact, it might be the shortest poem that she wrote. Not 100% sure about that, but just scanning through some of her work right here, it's an unusually short poem for her. So that might also play with the idea that that she had to be much more careful in this poem versus on the poem to the University of Cambridge, or on the death of the Reverend Dr. Sewell, or on the death of the Reverend George Whitfield, all poems that were widely praised at the time and poems that people looked at with a lot of interest, but more than likely none more than the one poem on being brought from Africa to America. In my reading of the poem, one of the things that stands out to me is her usage of the word pagan. If you look at the original version of this, the one that was published during her lifetime, the word pagan is italicized. And several other words are also italicized in this as well. Savior is italicized. Christian is italicized, but also the word Negro. And why I think that's interesting is that all of the words that she is italicizing tend to have religious connotations, with the exception of the word Negro, unless you put this on the level that she is saying, or unless you say that she is putting the African people on the same plane as these religious words that she used. So when she italicizes Savior, she also italicizes Negro. When she italicizes God, that she's italicizing Negro. When she italicizes Christian, she's also italicizing Negro. So she made a conscious effort to do that, and she did that on purpose. We don't know 100% why she did that, but I believe that it connects with this. And again, as I mentioned in class, when she talks about when she has the line, "'Twas mercy brought me from my pagan land," many of the people that saw that more than likely looked at this as something negative towards Africa, saying that that it was mercy that brought me, or it was mercy that brought me from a land that's non-Christian. And to many Christians at the time, they would have seen anything in non-Christian as in a negative light. So her saying this, probably to many of her censors, for lack of a better word, for the people that would have seen this, they would have seen the word pagan in a negative context. But what is interesting is that if you look through the rest of her other works, that paganism comes up throughout her pieces, throughout her work. She talks a lot about Christianity, so I don't want to take that away, and we can assume that her Christianity is very genuine. So I don't want to make any counter arguments to that. However, it's very interesting how much she talks about pagan gods within this work. So I'm going to show you another poem in here, and if you want to pause it and look up this poem so you can follow along, that would be great. I'll give you a second to do that if you like. Sorry, I find it myself. I had it marked and I lost it. But the poem that I'm looking at is, she's this other book, A Hymn to the Morning. This Hymn to the Morning. I'm going to read this and I'll go through it one more time, because to me this poem might say a lot about her as well. And again, we have to read through the lines with Phillis Wheatley because she didn't give us footnotes. We don't know exactly how she felt. We can look at her letters, we can look at some of her relations, we can compare other poems to other poems, understand her condition of biography, but we don't know exactly what she thought about that, which is the case for most poets. So very few poets will tell you specifically what they mean in every instance, unless you happen to talk to them right then. But even then, when we look at poetry, I like to see poetry as something that's a written form that's closest to the human heart, that explains what cannot otherwise be explained in prose. And we can assume that Wheatley is also doing this as well. But we also have to remember that she is in a condition that's very unlike most other poets at that time, or definitely in current time, that she was enslaved when she's writing most of these poems, and is only freed shortly before the book of poetry is even published. So all of this is written by somebody who is enslaved, and that's an important aspect of this work. A young African woman who's enslaved. All right, so this is a hymn to the morning. Attend my lays, ye ever honored nine. Assist my labors and my strains refine. In smoothest numbers pour the notes along, for bright Aurora now demands my song. Aurora, hail, and all the thousand eyes which deck thy progress through the vaulted skies. The morn awakes and wide extends her rays, on every leaf the gentle zephyr plays. Harmonious lays the feathered race resume, dart the bright eye and shake the painted plume. Ye shady groves your verdant gloom display, to shield the poet from the burning day. Calliope, awake the sacred lyre, while thy fair sisters fan the pleasing fire. The bowers, the gales, the variegated skies, and all their pleasures in my bosom rise. See in the east the illustrious king of day, his rising radiance drives the shades away. But oh, I feel his fervid beams too strong, and scarce begun concludes the abortive song. If this poem was a poem by Catullus, or if this poem was a poem by Martial, or if this was written by Sappho, was written by anybody from the classical times, this wouldn't be out of place in many ways. That she's writing this essentially to these Greco-Roman gods, and I find that interesting because when we think of the poem on being brought from Africa to America, she has the line in there about mercy brought me from my pagan land. And while that's seen in a negative context by a lot of people at her time, and really up until recent times, that none of these other poems really take that scrutiny, where people didn't pay as much attention to the paganism that she uses within this. So when she's saying that she mercy that was taken from her, brought her from her pagan land, she is able to slip in all these other poems that are clearly reverent of pagan gods, and while she's using this in ways that many people did at that time, with a heavy reference to Greco-Roman culture, Greco-Roman history, politics, etc. Remember, this is the age of democracy when it's coming up. Greek concept, Greek concept. We look at the White House, and this is being built. All these buildings and all these different places at the time all had this element of a Greco-Roman reverence. So she definitely is a part of that moment as well. However, when we think of this, when we know her condition, that when we see that mercy brought me from my pagan land, we see the pagan aspect that she is talking about here, and it's viewed as negative. That when she's referring to European paganism, then for some reason this doesn't seem to resonate in the same way. And it doesn't seem that it's merciful. That it's mercy that's bringing her away from any paganism that's taking place when she wakes up in the morning, looks out at the sky in Boston, and is remarking about how beautiful the day is. So I'm going to go through this poem again. So if you want to get this poem out and just set it on the side, look at it, that would be helpful just to understand what's going on in this text. So again, attend my lays, ye ever honored nine. So attend my lays, attend my songs, ye ever honored nine. The nine muses, famous nine muses. Assist my labors and my strains refine. In smoothest numbers pour the notes along, for bright Aurora now demands my song. Some scholars feel that the line, and I'll read that line again, in smoothest numbers pour the notes along, might be a reference to her mother, the idea of libations being poured, and maybe a memory that she has. And this comes from the memoir, quote unquote memoir, that was written by a relative of the Wheatley family. And she is the first person to really discuss Phyllis Wheatley as a human being and write up some kind of memoir of her. How much of that's true or not, we don't know. It's possible some of it is, possibly all of it is, most of it. But there's a lot of reason to be very skeptical of this. However, it's possible, that this is the case. So in that line, in smoothest numbers pour the notes along, for bright aurora now demands my song. What some of the scholars and what the memoir argues is that this is a memory that Phyllis had as a young child of her mother pouring water, and this being connected to some African rituals that go along with some of the religions of the part of West Africa where she was likely from, which is more than likely in the Senegambia region of Africa. Again, we don't know 100% if this is the case, but possibly. Bright aurora now demands my song. Aurora, hail in all the thousand dyes which deck thy progress through the vaulted skies. And aurora is seen as the god of resurrection, the god of something new, coming up, something bright new day. So aurora, hail in all the thousand dyes which deck thy progress through the vaulted skies. The morn awakes, and think of deck the skies, like deck the halls with boughs of holly, you're decorating. So which deck thy progress through the vaulted skies. The morn awakes and wide extends her rays, on every leaf the gentle zephyr plays. Harmonious lays, again songs, harmonious lays the feathered race resume, dart the bright eye and shake the painted plume. Talking about birds in the morning. Ye shady groves, your verdant gloom display to shield your poet from the burning day. When I see this poem, I just think of being out here in Florida at that moment right before the sun comes up. And it just feels so nice just for a few minutes, and then it's going to get hot. To shield your poet from the burning day. Calliope, awake the sacred lyre, while thy fair sisters fan the pleasing fire, the bowers, the gales, the variegated skies, and all their pleasures in my bosom rise. What I see in this, within this section of the poem, is the moment right as the sun is coming up. When the sun comes up, and if there's clouds in the sky, and it hits the clouds right at the perfect angle, and the sky is orange, pink, purple, and all of these beautiful colors, that it becomes very sublime, when you're looking at this. And just in that moment, while thy fair sister fan the pleasing fire, the bowers, the gales, the variegated skies, and all their pleasures in my bosom rise. Just that moment when you have to see that, just the beauty of nature at that time. See in the east the illustrious king of day, the king of day being the sun, coming up. Again, very pagan sounding. The king of day, his rising radiance drives the shades away. But oh, I feel his fervid beams too strong, and scarce begun concludes the abortive song. So when I see this poem, my thought is of that moment that she's capturing. She's capturing in the poetic sense the seconds when the sun is coming up, and just that beauty of sunrise. And also what that symbolizes too, the sunrise being symbolic of a new day, something coming up. And she talks about aurora, again, aurora being connected to the idea of resurrection. That could be Christian, but of course aurora wasn't a Christian god. So what that means, a rebirth, something new coming out. So I'm going to read this poem just one more time, and I'm going to have this just sit there, and then I want you to go through this and look through it and see if you see anything new in here. I will say with her vocabulary that I think her vocabulary is really great. I often find myself having to break out the dictionary sometimes with some of her words, not just the standard dictionary, but also having to look up who the gods are, what their many possible meanings that she uses, and even biblical ones too, when she's talking about the Bible and a number of her works. What are the other many possible readings of some of the verses that she reads from, that she writes. So I'm just going to read this one last, and then we'll leave it at this. This is, again, Phillis Wheatley, A Hymn to the Morning. And if you get a chance, you can get your hands on a copy of this book, get it, go outside in the morning, see the sun as it's coming up, and then think of Phillis Wheatley. Or just print this up, take a look at it on your phone, read it, and set your timer to wake up in the morning and enjoy the day. That's how I first went through this and started to go through this book, was by looking at it all in the morning and trying to be there as much as I could mentally and on the same plane as Phillis Wheatley. So, for my undying reverence for her, I read A Hymn to the Morning one more time. Attend my lays, ye ever-honored nine, assist my labors and my strains refine. In smoothest numbers pour the notes along, for bright Aurora now demands my song. Aurora, hail in all the thousand dyes, which deck thy progress through the vaulted skies. The morn awakes, and wide extends her rays, on every leaf the gentle zephyr plays. Harmonious lays the feathered race resume, dart the bright eye and shake the painted plume. Ye shady groves, your verdant gloom display, to shield your poet from the burning day. Calliope, awake the sacred lyre, while thy fair sisters fan the pleasing fire. The bowers, the gales, the variegated skies, in all their pleasures in my bosom rise. See in the east the illustrious king of day, his rising radiance drives the shades away. But oh, I feel his fervid beams too strong, and scarce begun concludes the abortive song. Phillis Wheatley.